HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Fly Girls, How 5 Daring Women Defied All Odds and Made Aviation History. By Keith O'Brien. Read by Erin Bennett. If you will tell me why or how people fall in love, I will tell you why or how I happened to take up aviation. Louise Thaden, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 1930. Introduction. In 1926, there were countless ways to die in an airplane. Propeller blades snapped and broke, and planes went down. Wings failed, folding backward or tearing away completely. Control sticks got stuck, sending airships hurtling toward crowds or hangars. And all too often, engines just stopped in mid-flight, forcing pilots to scan the ground below for a farmer's field or a cow pasture, any place where they might land in a hurry. "In such a crisis, there is no time to think," said one early pilot. "You either automatically do the right thing, or you die." In clear skies, pilots often made the wrong choice. In bad weather, they had even fewer options. Storms, squalls, rain, snow, and fog made flying almost impossible. In open cockpit planes, raindrops felt to pilots like little bullets hurled at their faces at 100 miles an hour. Goggles fogged up, paper maps blew away in the wind, and aviators became disoriented. A pilot, in moments like these, was instructed to find railroad tracks on the ground, the only discriminable object in an absolute gray of land and sky, and follow them. By doing so, a lost flyer could find the nearest town. But flying at 120 miles an hour just 50 feet off the tracks was treacherous too. In one such case, a pilot plowed his plane into a mountainside when the railroad entered a tunnel. Worse still, pilots could do everything right, navigate through the fog, dodge the mountains, survive emergency landings, and still lose, for reasons out of their control. In the 1920s, plane builders typically used wood to construct their machines, then stretched linen over the wings like pillowcases, and pulled the thin fabric tight around the spruce spars. These lightweight materials, covered in a protective lacquer, helped make flying possible. But the wood could rot, and the fabric could tear, dooming even the best flyers. As one aviation manual pointed out, many pilots have been killed in wood fuselage ships. Crashes in 1926 killed or injured 240 people, a small but significant number, given that the vast majority of Americans never flew and that the government couldn't be sure that it was counting every accident. Federal agents gathered their figures not from official calculations, but often from newspaper reports. Plane manufacturers had no required regulations, and instructors no required training. Flying, one pilot noted, is no place for slovenly methods or ideas. And yet, more than 2 decades after the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the slovenly climbed into cockpits every day, frightening the public and, at times, even themselves. "Would you ride in a lot of planes you know or with some of the pilots you know?" one man asked his fellow pilots at the time. "You know you would not." It was too dangerous. Even the so-called aviation experts were often unable to explain what caused planes to crash. Investigator: plane went into ground, nose first, causing complete wreck, so that it is hard to really tell what happened. Investigator: the reason for failure is hard to ascertain. Investigator: completely destroyed by fire. By the mid-1920s, the fledgling aircraft industry, eager to prove planes were safe, latched on to one idea capable of creating positive news coverage, marketable heroes, and excitement all at once: plane racing. Small affairs at first, the events quickly grew until pilots were competing against one another for headlines, fame, and the equivalent today of millions of dollars in what became known as the National Air Races. Soon, air-minded Americans weren't just reading about their favorite pilots darting across the ocean. They were watching them whip their planes around 50-foot-tall pylons at these races, or hearing them scream across the country in one race in particular, the greatest test of speed, strength, and skill, financed by important men with large egos, the Bendix Trophy Race. "It has become," one pilot said of the Bendix, "one of our national institutions, like the World Series." These races were often fatal for pilots, too risky for discerning men and, according to many men and the media, no place at all for women. In the late 1920s, newspapers and magazines routinely published articles questioning whether a woman should be allowed to fly anywhere, much less in these races. That such questions could be posed, and taken seriously, might strike us today as outlandish, but they were all too typical of the age. American women had earned the right to vote only a few years earlier, and laws still forbade them to serve on juries, drive taxicabs, or work night shifts. It is not surprising, then, that the few women who dared to enter the elite, male-dominated aviation fraternity endured a storm of criticism and insults. They weren't aviators, as far as the men were concerned. They were petticoat pilots, ladybirds, flying flappers, and sweethearts of the air. They were just girl flyers, the most common term for female pilots at the time. But in 1926, a new generation of female pilots was emerging, and they refused to be pigeonholed, mocked, or excluded. Instead, they united to fight the men in a singular moment in American history, when air races in open cockpit planes attracted bigger crowds than opening day at Yankee Stadium and an entire Sunday of NFL games combined. These were no sweethearts, no ladybirds. If the women aviators had to have a name, they were fly girls, a term used in the 1920s to describe female pilots and, more broadly, young women who refused to live by the old rules, appearing bold and almost dangerous as a result. As one newspaper put it in the mid-1920s, "The people are exhorted to swat the fly, but it is safer to keep your hands off the fly girl." It's a story that plays out over one tumultuous decade when gender roles were shifting, cultural norms were evolving, and the Great Depression had people questioning almost everything in America. At the beginning, in 1927, even independent women interested in aviation would think of themselves as mere cargo to be ferried from point to point. At the end, just a few years later, women would compete head-to-head against men in that great transcontinental race for the Bendix Trophy. A woman, many believed, could never beat a man in such a competition. But in 1936, one woman did, in a stunning upset that finally proved women not only belonged in the air, they could rule. Among them were wives and mothers, divorcees and heiresses, teachers and bankers, daredevils and starlets. And 5 women in particular: Ruth Elder, a charming wife from Alabama who paid the price for going first; Amelia Earhart, a lost soul living with her mother on the outskirts of Boston and desperate for a way out; Ruth Nichols, a daughter of Wall Street wealth in New York, hungry to make a name of her own; Louise McFetridge Thaden, a small-town dreamer from rural Arkansas who wanted it all: a job, a family, fame, but in the end would have to make a difficult choice. And Florence Klingensmith, a young pilot from the northern plains whose great gamble in the sky would alter history on the ground. In the decades to follow, only one of these 5 women would be remembered. But for a few years, before each of the women went missing in her own way, these female pilots captivated a nation, racing across the ocean or across the country, hoping to beat one another and longing to beat the men. At times, 100,000 people swarmed dusty airfields to watch them compete, darting through the sky in their colorful planes of robin's egg blue and pale orchid, scarlet red and gleaming white, purple and cream and cobalt and silver, and racing. An impossible tale playing out in a deadly sky in an unforgiving time. It began on the Kansas prairie, with a hard wind blowing. Part 1. 1. The Miracle of Wichita. The coal peddlers west of town, on the banks of the Arkansas River, took note of the new saleswoman from the moment she appeared outside the plate glass window. It was hard not to notice Louise McFetridge. She was young, tall, and slender, with distinct features that made her memorable if not beautiful. She had a tangle of brown hair, high cheekbones, deep blue eyes, thin lips programmed to smirk, and surprising height for a woman. At 5'8¼ inches, she took pride in that quarter-inch. McFetridge was usually the tallest woman in the room and sometimes taller than the cowboys, drifters, cattlemen, and businessmen she passed on the sidewalks of Wichita, Kansas. But it wasn't just how she looked that made her remarkable to the men selling coal near the river. It was the way she talked. McFetridge was educated. She'd had a couple years of college and spoke with perfect grammar. Perhaps more notable, she had a warm Southern accent, a hint that she wasn't from around Wichita. She was born in Arkansas, 250 miles east, raised in tiny Bentonville, and different from most women in at least one other way. Louise was boyish. That's how her mother put it. Her daughter, she told others, was a follower of boyish pursuits. And that wasn't meant as a compliment. It was, for the McFetridges, cruel irony. Louise's parents, Roy and Edna, had wanted a boy from the beginning. They prayed on it, making clear their desires before the Lord, and they believed their faith would be rewarded. Somehow, her mother said, we were sure our prayers would be answered. The McFetridges had even chosen a boy's name for the baby, and then they got Louise. Edna could doll her daughter up in white dresses as much as she wanted. Louise would inevitably find a way to slip into pants or overalls and scramble outside to get dirty. She rounded up stray dogs. She tinkered with the engine of her father's car, and sometimes she joined him on his trips selling mentholatum products across the plains and rural South, work that had finally landed the McFetridges here in Wichita in the summer of 1925 and placed Louise outside the coal company near the river. It was a hard time to be a woman looking for work, with men doing almost all the hiring and setting all the standards. Even for menial jobs, like selling toiletries or cleaning houses, employers in Wichita advertised that they wanted attractive girls with pleasing personalities and good complexions, right stating age, height, weight, and where last employed. The man who owned the coal company had different standards, however. Jack Turner had come from England around the turn of the century with nothing but a change of clothes and $7 in his pocket. He quickly lost the money. But Turner, bookish and bespectacled in round glasses, made it back over time by investing in horses and real estate and the city he came to love. Wichita, he said, is destined to become a metropolis of the plains. By 1925, people went to him for just about everything: hay, alfalfa, bricks, stove wood, and advice. While others were still debating the worth of female employees, Turner argued as early as 1922 that workers should be paid what they were worth, no matter their gender. He predicted a future where men and women would be paid equally based on skill, where they would demand such a thing, in fact. And with his worldly experience, Turner weighed in on everything from war to politics. But he was known, most of all, for coal. Everything in coal, his advertisements declared. In winter, when the stiff prairie winds howled across the barren landscape, the people of Wichita came to Turner for coal. In summer, they did too. It was never too early to begin stockpiling that vital fuel, he argued. Coal is scarce, Turner told customers in his ads. Fill your coal bin now. He hired Louise McFetridge not long after she arrived in town, and she was thankful for the work. For a while, McFetridge, just 19, was able to stay focused on her job, selling the coal, selling fuel. But by the following summer, her mind was wandering, following Turner out the door, down the street, and into a brick building nearby, just half a block away. The sign outside was impossible to miss. Travel Air Airplane Manufacturing Company, it said. Aerial transportation to all points. It was a humble place, squat and small, but the name, Travel Air, was almost magical, and the executive toiling away on the factory floor inside was the most unusual sort. He was a pilot. Walter Beach was just 35 that summer, but already he was losing his hair. His long, oval face was weathered from too much time spent in an open cockpit, baking in the prairie sun, and his years of hard living in a boarding house on South Water Street were beginning to show. He smoked, he drank, he flew. On weekends, he attended fights and wrestling matches at the Forum downtown. In the smoky crowd, shoulder to shoulder with mechanics and leather workers, there was the aviator Walter Beach, a long way from his native Tennessee, but in Kansas for good. I want to stay in Wichita, he told people, if Wichita wants me to stay. The reason was strictly professional. In town, there were 2 airplane factories, and Beach was the exact kind of employee they were looking to hire. He had learned all about engines while flying for the U.S. Army in Texas. If Beach pronounced a plane safe, anyone would fly it. Better still, he'd fly it himself, working with zeal, untiring zeal, one colleague said. And thanks to these skills, a unique combination of flying experience, stunting talent, and personal drive, Beach had managed to move up to vice president and general manager at Travel Air. He worked not only for Turner, but for a man named Clyde Cessna, and Beach's job was mostly just to fly. He was supposed to sell Travel Air ships by winning races, especially the 1926 Ford Reliability Tour, a 2,600-mile contest featuring 25 pilots flying to 14 cities across the Midwest, with all of Wichita watching. Now, right now, is Wichita's chance, one newspaper declared on the eve of the race. Neglected, it will not come again. Forever. Beach, flying with a young navigator known as Bryce Goldie Goldsboro, felt a similar urgency. The company had invested $12,000 in the Travel Air plane he was flying, a massive amount, equivalent to roughly $160,000 today. If he failed in the reliability race, if he lost or, worse, crashed, he would have to answer to Cessna and Turner, and he knew there were plenty of ways to fail. A loose nut, he said, or a similar, seemingly inconsequential thing has lost many a race. And so he awoke early the day the contest began and went to the airfield in Detroit. Observers would have seen a quiet shadow near the starting line, checking every bolt, instrument, and, of course, the engine. A $5,700 contraption, nearly half the price of the expensive plane. "Don't save this motor," the engine man advised Beach before he took off on the first leg of the journey, urging him to open it up. "Let's win the race." Beach pushed the throttle as far as it would go. He was first into Kalamazoo, first into Chicago. With Goldsborough's help, he flew without hesitation into the fog around St. Paul, coming so close to the ground and the lakes below that journalists reported that fish leaped out of the water at Beach's plane. While some pilots got lost or waited out the weather in Milwaukee, Beach won again, defeating the field by more than 20 minutes. He prevailed as well in Des Moines and Lincoln and, finally, the midway point in the race, Wichita, winning that leg by almost 7 minutes despite a leaking carburetor. "It's certainly good to be back home again," Beach said to the crowd of 5,000 people after stepping out of the cockpit. "The old town looks good to me, and wonderfully restful after the strain of hard, fast flying." A beauty queen, Miss Wichita, presented him with a gold-plated key to the city. And 6 days later, back in Detroit, in front of a much bigger crowd of 30,000 people, race officials gave Beach the Edsel B. Ford Trophy and a check for $2,500. He and the other pilots had covered a total of 61,000 miles, flying on despite 8 accidents, 12 forced landings, and 1 fatality, when a taxiing plane hit a man on the ground, shredding his body with its propeller. 6 planes didn't finish, and 2 had to be shipped home in boxcars, unable to fly anywhere anymore. But if the point of the Ford tour was reliability, Travel Air, with Beach at the controls, had proven something. The phone back in Kansas began ringing with plane orders and praise for one man. Walter Beach, full-page ads declared, misspelling the name of the new hero, Wichita's own. At the Hotel Broadview downtown, the city's elite honored Beach that September with speeches and toasts. Jack Turner presented him with a fur-lined flying suit, and the publisher of the Wichita Eagle compared him to Christopher Columbus. But Beach deflected the attention to his navigator Goldsborough, to their moneyed backers, and to all the hard-working men of the boarding houses on South Water Street. "Let us consider," Beach said, "that not every hometown boy is a fool. Let us consider listening to their arguments of what they can do. Pick out a miracle that is possible for them to accomplish." McFetridge knew she was shirking her work, shorting Turner with her lack of coal sales. But she couldn't help it. Day after day, she drifted to the Travel Air hangar in the tall grass east of town, sticking out amid the grease-stained mechanics, fuel men, and pilots, but feeling at home among them. As a girl back in Bentonville, she had longed to accomplish miracles of her own. McFetridge once jumped from the second story of a barn just to see what it felt like. She drove her father's car long before she was old enough to have a driver's license, and she sometimes did things just because others said they couldn't be done. In Bentonville, townspeople liked to turn out for funeral processions, watching the deceased clatter by in a casket pulled by a horse-drawn cart. Once, to impress the other children, Louise accepted a dare to run along behind the procession, climb aboard the moving cart, and hang upside down by her knees near the casket as it rolled down the road. It was a trick that the kids in town thought impossible until Louise finally did it, earning the wrath of her parents and the admiration of her peers. Now, lingering at the airfield in Wichita, McFetridge was flirting with trouble yet again. It was only a matter of time before her boss, Jack Turner, found her there when she should have been selling coal. McFetridge expected to get fired when it finally happened. Instead, she got a phone call from Walter Beach himself. He and Turner had a proposition for her, a different job. They wanted her to work for Travel Air's new West Coast distributor, D.C. Warren. With a young woman at Warren's side, especially a tall, blue-eyed woman like McFetridge, reporters were sure to pay attention to Travel Air. "Warren has agreed to take you out to San Francisco," Beach told McFetridge at their meeting. "Your salary won't be high, but he will teach you this aviation business and see that you learn how to fly." McFetridge was stunned. Her parents were too. They had long known that their daughter was unusual, a challenge. Her mother had even accepted the fact that Louise would never be a traditional woman, but was destined to work. In competition with men, her mother predicted. But this was too much, even for them. "Oh, Louise," her mother said, disapproving. Her father wasn't pleased either. He considered calling Beach to officially state his opposition to his daughter's taking this job, and perhaps to her flying anywhere, with any man, ever. But Louise talked him out of making the call. "It is," she told her parents, "the one thing I want to do." Not long after, in early April 1927, she said goodbye to her family, to her job selling coal, and to everything else flat and unfulfilling in Wichita, and climbed into a Travel Air plane headed west. It was cold in Wichita that morning, almost freezing, yet the sky over the prairie was blue, giving McFetridge a clear view of the ground from the passenger seat of the little plane bound for the coast. By nightfall, she had reached San Francisco. 2. Devotedly, Ruth. Across the continent from McFetridge in California, another young woman pondered a move of her own. She lived in a house so big it required no street number. The Nichols family gave their address as simply Gracechurch Street, Rye, New York. It was about 20 miles north of Midtown Manhattan in quiet Westchester County, nestled near the ocean on the Connecticut border, and visitors summoned to the house couldn't miss it, all 3 stories of it, with its sprawling property and servants' quarters. But inside, the house was dark and scary for children. Dead animals mounted on the wall stared down on the formal proceedings. A massive grandfather clock ticked away, tolling morosely on the hour. In the dining room, proper manners were to be observed while the family ate off fine china, and any child who broke the rules might be forced to answer to the owners of the house, Erickson and Edith Nichols, and possibly banished to dine with the family's servants. In 1925, there were 3 of them. The oldest child, a daughter, had at least one thing going for her. She wouldn't be there for long. Ruth Nichols was expected to marry well. She was to cut short her education, no college for Nichols, to make sure that happened. And like any girl raised in New York and steeped in old money in the 1920s, Nichols understood the deal. From a young age, she knew that one day she would make her debut, and all the papers would cover it in their society pages. Then her parents would find her a husband and plan a wedding, and all the papers would cover that too. It didn't matter if she wanted to resist. Her parents had a plan for Ruth, and she felt compelled to follow it to please her parents, especially father. Ruth simply couldn't disappoint Daddykins, as she called him, or Motherkins, a practicing Quaker devoted to God, her husband, and Ruth. "My precious Ruthie," she called her, "the blessedest girl. Thee mustn't worry, dear. Just trust our Heavenly Father." And yet, Nichols was worried, increasingly burdened with anxiety and guilt and an important question. Did I have a right to live my own life? Shortly after her 18th birthday, in early 1919, she got a taste of what that might feel like. A flyer named Eddie Stinson from Detroit was in Atlantic City giving rides, and Ruth's father wanted her to have one. He paid $10 for the privilege.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?